Hi, Nick. How are you, mate?
Doing well, Shane. How you doing?
Good, thanks. Everybody, welcome to OD and Chill Live, episode 137. Today we have Nick from Contentful, in all the way from the States, to talk about all things CMS and Contentful. We are streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We will take live questions throughout the session, so feel free if you've got any burning questions about, Nick and all the amazing things that Contentful do, feel free to pop them in. We'd love to get to those throughout the session. And yeah, we're really looking forward to having a chat. So, Nick, I'd love you to just introduce yourself and tell us where you're sitting and where you are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So great to be here. Nick Switzer. I'm a solution engineer at Contentful and based in Denver, Colorado in the US. I'm in my home office right now, which is just in kind of the northwest suburbs right up against the mountains. But Contentful's also got a super beautiful office in a high rise downtown Denver that I get to go into and hang out with the coworkers every once in a while.
Nice. Is that the Contentful head office in Denver?
It is. Yep. So we're one in Denver, one in Berlin, and then a couple other
Sick.
smaller ones. Yep.
Nice. Did you move to Denver for Contentful, or did you end up there just coincidentally?
No, lifelong Coloradan actually. I've kind of been all along what we call the Front Range here in Colorado, just like all the cities that kind of run right along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Grew up a little ways south of Denver, went to college a little ways north of Denver, and then landed in Denver with my wife and kids. It's a good place to be.
Sick, sick. So tell me how you ended up in tech and working at this job and where that went to from, being around there in college into working to Contentful.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a journey, I suppose, just in the sense that I've always kind of been one of those people who's had a sort of passive interest in tech, I guess, like building computers as a kid and GeoCities websites and stuff like that. And then, going into high school, I kind of had a dream to be a writer and found journalism and newspapers and went that direction in college and realized I was a little too introverted to be a reporter that was willing to like really get in everybody's face, and kind of stumbled into a really great program at the University of Colorado that got me into tech. And I lined that up with my journalism degree, ended up working as the online editor of our college newspaper. And that was kind of like right when CMS was starting to I don't know, get big, like get to be a thing. Like everyone wasn't just building their own homegrown CMS. So built us a website on like Dreamweaver, migrated that to WordPress, and then moved into an editorial newsroom actually in Boulder, Colorado, which is again a little ways north of Denver there. Kind of like ran a little bit of the tech side of things, sat in advertising, also in editorial. Newspapers kind of tanked in Denver, moved to an
And
agency,
everywhere in the world.
and everywhere in the world. 2008 wasn't kind to newspapers for a lot of reasons. But I mean, like it was kind of indirectly kind to me, I guess, in the sense that just I landed at an agency that I worked at for 11 years prior to my time at Contentful, and was fortunate enough to start when they were really small and then really grow with the dev team and have the opportunity to, continue building in CMS, kind of learn how everything works, like start to understand like the client side of it. I mean, just kind of all of the strategy and business acumen and branding. And, there's so much that goes into that process. And I ended up running that dev team there that, I grew it to about 20 people by the time I left 2 years ago, and then came to Contentful, and we got a lot more into the composable ecosystem.
Yeah, nice. Your history is kind of similar to mine, and except the opposite, where I don't have that much agency experience, and you have heaps. You've jumped to vendor side, and I'm now sitting on agency side after just only being
Yeah,
brand my whole career.
yeah, I would not have guessed that about you. you,
Yeah.
you wear the agency side well.
Oh, thanks, mate. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. So going back to, I suppose, our first conversations and sort of how we became friends, probably what was it like just under 12 months ago now, you
Mhm.
sort of put in front of us and said, hey, I know you guys are chatting to Hastings Deering at the moment. We're also chatting to them and they're a current client, but they're looking to expand their work. Should we get together and do a little bit more there? Do you want to touch on, where that's come from and where that's going to for you guys?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we were very fortunate to find each other on that one, because I think it just ended up being a really good fit. And it was kind of one of those, I think I wouldn't, I don't know, saying a classic implementation of Contentful or a classically
Yes.
good fit for Contentful is a kind of dumb thing to say, but I mean, it really was like just a good fit all around in the sense that they had kind of started to dip their toes into Contentful and like understand what it was all about, build a little bit of expertise in house and see the value that it was bringing to their team. I mean, just kind of that whole idea that you get out of composable and agile and like the ability to win early and win often and show value right away, right? So that you can continue to do that internally. And I think when we met up, it was kind of like right at the tail end of that initial cycle of showing value internally, and like the team at Hastings Deering was starting to realize like, okay, this actually has legs. This is something we can really do something with. And our team, like we had quite a few conversations with them leading up to bringing you all in to just help them start to see how it all comes together and how it scales, and how you make it a good thing for non-technical people too, right? Because I feel like the benefits of this stuff are pretty obvious to people who have experience in like tech and microservices, and I mean even like object-oriented programming, right? Like there are concepts there that relate and it clicks with those people. But I think like the other side of the house, I think you really have to help them understand like ultimately we want to make this easier for you. Like we want to make your life better. We want to make you like get work done faster. We want to make you not hate managing digital content. And
like
and I mean like go ahead.
I was just going to say it's that we literally were brought in at that transition from, okay, the CTO gets it and he's kind of on board. Now, who's going to end up using this, and can we bring them along as a part of the journey? That was essentially like the cross section. So it was sort of perfect for us and me particularly to go, all right, how do we show these people that it's going to make their lives easier? And
right.
Yeah, I found that just so interesting as a part of that journey, because we basically from initial conversation to starting the implementation was like a couple of weeks, with which in an organization like that. And to give the viewers context, Hastings Deering is the Caterpillar distributor. So they look after heavy machinery in Australia. They are not a traditional e-commerce, fashion or beauty or retailer like that. These guys are selling multi-million-dollar machinery. And so for them, the content journey, the customer journey is really different to what you're used to. But the natural thread that we, I suppose, found was the internal staff's journey is very similar to everyone else. And they were having huge problems with a legacy monolithic platform where the marketing team just wasn't empowered. And so we basically said, you give us 6 weeks and we think we can prove out that, 1, this will work and your CTO will be happy with it. And then 2, that we can actually do an implementation that makes everyone's lives easier to use that product moving forward. And really that was leveraging the power of Contentful.
Yeah, well, and what I love about it is I feel like even, after having been at Contentful for a little over 2 years, I'm still kind of amazed at how fast things can actually move in reality, because I mean, it's like you read the case studies and the results and like how quickly stuff just like tends to happen. And then, you get in front of a timeline like that and you're kind of like, yeah, let's see if these Overdose guys can come in and work some magic, and then it comes together, right? Because like the tech works well, like you all obviously have the expertise to bring it together. And I think when you just have that really great combination of like a team that's willing to do that, like the team was at Hastings Deering, and then a team like both of ours were, where we're working together on it. We're not kind of like constantly fighting, and it doesn't really feel like, I guess, what me as someone who's been on the post sales side for so long would describe as like a traditional software sales process, which I think feels like such a again, coming from somebody in a sales org now, like feels like such a kind of like dirty word sometimes, but it's just it's not that, it's a team working together to prove value and just like get things done quickly, and it just always kind of seems to be that, which is very cool.
Yeah, there's a few interesting threads there which I'd kind of like to unpick a little bit. Oh, cheers, by the way. It's different time zone,
Yeah.
so I'm on coffee. But I appreciate you bringing a drink to make Friday afternoons a bit more exciting for
Yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah. Thursday night for me.
Yeah, you can have tomorrow off. It's fine. Um, so yeah, one of the threads that I wanted to unpick there was the, I suppose for some people watching who are sitting on a monolithic tech stack, who are used to, particularly when you're looking at like really big stuff, you're looking at Salesforce Commerce Cloud, or you're looking at Sitecore, or you're looking at the really chunky end of town. As far as tech, they're used to 2-year implementation roadmaps, right? Like it's pretty standard when you're doing
Right.
a large scale change traditionally, and this is what you would have, like your history would have been, is like making large scale tech changes in big organizations used to be, this thing's going to take 6 months to 2 years, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about how Contentful approaches speed, how it approaches proving out a concept? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your point of view on that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and I'll say first, I think just like, your comments about kind of that 2-year cycle, with the monoliths really, like, that resonates. I feel like that's a conversation I have often just because like I lived that for such a long time. You feel like you just kind of get in that groove of like, and I mean, it's kind of just what it was from kind of like the early 2000s up until maybe, I don't know, 2015, when this really started to pick up momentum, that everybody just sort of accepted that like, okay, like the cycle is we issue an RFP every 3 years, we rebrand, we replatform, and then we roll with it until it's just
Yeah,
like, you drive it into the ground basically. Right.
yeah,
And so I guess like all of that to give a little bit of context to the actual question that you asked, just kind of like, how does Contentful, think about and approach speed? And I mean, I think ultimately it's about just like finding the places that you can get value out of the platform and the ecosystem around it, and how you can do that quickly, right? Because like, and I mean, even to the point about the monolithic solutions and stuff like that, is like, Contentful isn't something that's necessarily built to just like get dropped in and replace that massive solution in a 2-year implementation cycle, right? It's about us working really closely with like strategic partners like you all, like our other tech partners, to identify like where the real pain is, and where we can show value quickly, get in, do that, and then just like keep doing that cycle over and over, right? And I think like you just see so many different ways that works well for companies. Everything from like it makes the marketers and content creators lives easier because you don't have to train them on this massive system where they have to have all these like manuals and training videos to remember how to do 800 different things. They get in the system, learn how to do the thing they need to do, and then that builds, right? It builds
yep,
over time, and it just starts to feel natural. And I mean, like I said about sitting alongside the other platforms, like you can push content into those platforms from Contentful, you can consume it from Contentful, you can push it out to multiple different
yeah.
channels, but manage it in a
Let
single
let's
place.
talk
Go
about
ahead.
that. Just
Yeah,
taking a
yeah.
step back for a second. So I think the really interesting thing here is that there's a thread that I really love, and I'm not sure if this is a narrative that you sort of subscribe to, but the fact that you came from journalism, which is purely about content, and content is king, and now you've
Mm-hmm.
ended up at somewhere whose essentially their tech mission is to bring content to the forefront and make it easier to use, make it easier to integrate and get in front of consumers. Um, how do you see that as like a changing? Because what I've seen in sort of my time at OD is you're having one of two conversations when you talk about going into a space where you're leveraging the power of content. And one is you're having a developer, tech, CTO conversation where they're going, yeah, let's talk about the backend systems and the integration, how that information flows through. And I'm sure that's a conversation that you have every day. Now, the other side of things is when you get to have the CMO, the marketing conversation, or the brand side conversation, they're like, I want it to look like this. I'm really excited about the beauty and what we can do here and how we can leverage this. What's your sort of take on the best way to start a conversation internally inside an organization as to go, hey, here's the end result? Or do we go, hey, here's the stack that we have and how this would fit into it?
Oh man, that's that's a good one. I mean, I don't know that there's a single clear answer to that because I mean, I
Mm,
think it depends so much on the situation, right? And I think like it's ultimately I mean, we've talked about this a bit before, but I mean, I think ultimately it's about empathy, right? It's like it's about empathy for the people using the thing, empathy for and using the thing, I mean the content creators, but also the end users and the business and just you have to be really aware of what's going on with everyone around the project and what's the thing that's causing them pain and show them as quickly as possible how you can help with that, right?
mm,
And I think like it's really kind of the foundational idea of value selling. It's like I don't want to sit in front of a CMO and be like, oh, let me talk to you about our live preview and our live preview SDK and you can just add this button to the sidebar and it's so neat. It's like, you want to show them like, hey, you told me you're spending 40 resource hours a week like building landing pages. That sucks. Let me show you how I can compress that down to 2 hours, and
yeah.
then show
And
them
you
just
don't
like
have to
side by
call
side
a
a page
dev.
coming together.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No dependence on devs, but that doesn't mean you're shutting down your devs. It means you can work in parallel. Right.
Mm,
So I think I don't know. I'm kind of like just rambling now, but like focusing it back in a little bit, I think it is just about really focusing on those critical business issues that are bringing pain to the key stakeholders involved and addressing those head on. And I think a partnership like ours, like Contentful and Overdose, can bring that really to the next level, because now you're not just talking to Contentful about like how you solve your content problems or how you solve like your ecosystem orchestration problems. You're talking to like two closely aligned like strategic partners who can help you think about like how do we show ROI on this thing as best as possible and do that quickly.
yeah. Yeah. I love having and one of the things I've really enjoyed about you guys is you like getting your hands dirty as far as the nitty gritty and going like
Mm.
you mentioned just there. Oh my God, it's taking you 40 hours to get a landing page up. That's a huge issue. Let's prove out a
Right.
business case with you to solve that issue. And I love that stuff. I'd love to take a more of a helicopter view right now, just sort of generally what you're seeing. What are you seeing in the market as attracting people to something like Contentful? And what are you seeing as like the output of implementation right now? Are you guys working heaps in, blending fashion content into product pages, or what is it for someone who's never heard of a headless CMS, who doesn't really know what it does, who's really on brand side and going like, these guys keep talking about content but it sounds like a tech conversation? What does it look
Mm.
like in the market right now for you and Contentful?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think something I've been thinking about a lot, like as it relates to that, and something that always comes up, and I feel like we're sort of in this. I don't know that I want to say post COVID, because I'm not sure we'll ever like truly be post COVID, but I mean just in the sense that like COVID came, everybody panicked because they had to get online any way they could. Now that has subsided a little bit, and people are sort of starting to figure out like, okay, we have omni-channel, we have all these different ways we need to interact with our users, and it's a lot more than just your website feeling like walking through the aisles of your brick and mortar store, if you even have a
Mm,
brick and mortar store, right? And I think what that comes down to is just like the art of storytelling, the art of digital storytelling,
mm,
right? And I think that's where a platform like Contentful can really bring a lot of value, because it doesn't have to be a really complicated experience for the person telling those stories to bring them to life on the web, or anywhere. I shouldn't even say on the web, like on the web, on your mobile app, on your Alexa skill, like on your smart fridge or your store kiosk, like whatever it might be. But I think like it just really empowers marketers to do more than just kind of like put a CTA on a PDP, right?
mm.
Or call to action on a product detail page for anyone
Yeah.
who's not like up to speed with all the 1,000 acronyms we've probably been using. And I think that's just like such a key part of that overall experience that everyone's realizing they don't have and they need, and it needs to be easy to produce, because you can't,
Mm.
I mean, I'm sure, well, I don't know actually if here's a question for you. Do you remember the New York Times story Snowfall from like years ago? Was that ever like on your radar?
No, tell me.
So it was a big thing for me, and I think just a lot of people in my sphere of influence, because it was kind of the first like really media rich, like long form story that a more traditional media outlet had done online. It was just this like
Mm.
fantastically like well produced like story that the New York Times had online with like lots of full screen video, in the time before like people were really thinking that way, just because the internet hadn't quite evolved to the point that technology that could support that well existed. But I think like that type of media experience now, is so much easier to produce for
Mm.
somebody who isn't technical, because then, I mean, my assumption at least was that like to make something like that happen, you're basically mocking it up, writing the story in like InDesign, and then sending those comps to a developer to build the thing out, because you have to do all your like crazy, jQuery parallax stuff that just doesn't happen with like a
Yeah.
dynamic backend. But now you can build that really like rich content. And I mean, like, one customer of ours that I know is doing it really well is Bang& Olufsen, like the super high end
Mm.
audio company out of Europe, and they do some super cool stuff on their website where they write these. They call them craft stories, and they write these like really great like long form articles with all this rich media about, like, there's one I love about someone who's responsible for polishing the metal, and just like his process for polishing those. And then like you get to the bottom of it and it's like, hey, here's a selection of the speakers that have gone through this polishing process. And then you can immediately, you know, drop into the conversion funnel from there, right? But like
Yeah.
by doing that, you immediately have like a more emotional connection with this thing that you're buying, because you're like, oh, maybe this was polished by Finn. Like, I'm a lot more willing to like look into this now and like, spend the money that it might take to get into this like high-end audio. And I think just like kind of circling back to the question you'd originally asked, I think like a lot more brands are realizing the value of that, and realizing that commerce needs to be more than just kind of like click, add to cart, buy. It's a much more complex interaction with
Yeah.
users and buyers.
One of the things that I find so interesting, particularly this year, it's been such a weird year for us as far
Mm,
as the big implementations that we're doing, particularly with you guys. You're not talking about a traditional D2C e-commerce brand, right? Like if you look at the clients, we've got a global bike marketplace. You've got someone selling excavators and diggers. You've got
mm,
someone who's selling iron ore and titanium online. And then you've got someone who sells safety documentation and has a auditing app. Like none of those things scream like, oh, the power of leveraging the power of content, right? But it
mm,
seems to me it's the organizations that suffer from, and like I hope none of them take offense to this, of being a little bit more boring, who are actually seeing the value in working hard to produce a story, to tell that narrative, to make it more
mm.
beautiful, make it more interesting for their end consumer, because their end consumer is used to being emailed a catalog or having to
Right.
download a PDF manual. And they've just gotten so bored and desensitized that these people have some really forward thinking staff that have come in and gone, we can make this a beautiful experience. And I find
Mm,
that so interesting that it's like, it seems to be for me this year, and it may be that market dynamics and those people still have CapEx spend available to do good, like chunky projects. But it also seems to me that the most unique and forward thinking people aren't coming from the places where I imagine they would with content creation. They're coming from places where it's actually really hard and they're doing like a true grind. It's like
mm.
working for the Financial Times trying to make a story really engaging to the general public. It's like, oh, economic data isn't fun, but you can make it look pretty. And it's people doing that sort of
Yeah.
work, which I'm really enjoying working with, and I seem really leveraging the power of Contentful.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great point, because like I came from the world of like the agency I was at. We did a lot of work with B2B clients, and we did some like ABM consulting on top of that. And like on the surface, that's not the most exciting work, right? But I think I mean, like for me, I was on the tech side much more than like the brand and the storytelling side. But I think even, as an outsider looking in, that's what made it that much more fascinating, is when you don't have, like a super sexy product. I mean, like, I don't know, like what's a really easy, like Red Bull, or any of the like big surf brands or skate brands or snowboard brands or something like that. You just have like beautiful visuals immediately to like make this
Yeah.
thing compelling, right? And like in the B2B space, it's not quite that. But I mean, to your point, I don't think that means you don't have an interesting story to tell and you wouldn't benefit from, meeting your users closer to where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And like putting some of that same like love and care and, brand strategy into the way you interact with your users. And I mean, you're going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier to handle that, like when you don't have to rely on your tech team to do it all for you.
Yeah, for sure. Questions just come through. Someone's asked, "What's the most beautiful site you've ever seen?" And I'll give you a pass. It doesn't have to be a contentful one.
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to hear sort of what you've seen out there that you're like, man, that is just absolutely stunning.
Oh man, that's that's a hard one.
I'll start if you want while you
Yeah,
think
go
about it.
ahead. Go ahead.
Um, so there's not a particular brand, but there's a number of brands in the luxury fashion space which I see doing almost runway shows with their sites, and they're using them as a pop-up to do basically a runway show. So they'll have their standard transactional commerce site, and when they launch a new collection, they're going, here's essentially the collection curated in the most beautiful manner that you can. And that can be with like, the traditional way to do it was go like, here's a beautiful image and chuck some hotspots on it.
Hmm.
Now it's the same sort of journalistic story that you're going, where they've obviously got a creative director to go, what pieces do we show first? How do we show those pieces? Are we using rich content? Are we using video? Are we using video of the photo shoots of the e-commerce product? Like, how are we sort of layering that in? And it's almost like a journey where if it's the first time someone's come to the site for a while, they're shown the collection introduction before they're shown anything else. And I see some amazing work in that luxury fashion space that I think super inspiring.
Yeah, that's a good one. I really like the feel of a lot of those brands. So
Mm.
I hear you there. And like as you're talking, I think my answer is probably a little bit cliche, but I mean, like, we were talking about Apple Vision Pro recently. I mean, I think like
Yeah.
that landing page is good, and it's like not even it's that landing page, but I think I'm also just consistently blown away by Apple's, like, I mean, everybody knows this, but Apple's like level of design, level of consistency, level of polish. And I mean, it's like all of those wild scrolling effects and stuff, like from a technical standpoint, are not easy to get right. And I think there's always this, again, coming from like the implementation background, I think there's always this really interesting tension between like the creative director and the development director, right? I mean, like that was the battle I fought all the time, right? It's like, are you serious? Like, how are we going to make this thing a reality, But you need that vision from outside the technical team to push that forward. And I think the way like Apple brings that together on those like product specific landing pages they do is just like really, really impressive, because everyone is good. And I would be really interested to see sort of a timeline, like looking back at maybe, the landing page for the original iPhone versus like what they're doing for the Apple Vision Pro, just to see how different those look and feel because of how like design has changed, how browser technology has changed, because it's like they're always on the cutting edge of that stuff. And I think the last thing I'll say is what I really appreciate is how intentionally they use all of those effects, right? Because I think you can just, you know, all the scrolling effects, they get kind of janky, they get kind of annoying. Like, they were really cool when they first came out, but I think Apple still does a really good job of using those for a real reason, and I
Mm.
think specifically on that page, the way they kind of like pull the device apart and you can see like the light shield and the goggle and like the headband, and the way they come together and like put hotspots on them. And I think just all of that feels like very intentional and polished, and it just like works and it gets the message across. And I think
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, it probably resonates with my mom as much as it resonates with me, right? And I
Yeah.
think like that's a sign of like something very well done.
Yeah. I, I think that's actually a really cool segue. And I know there's probably like 90% of podcasts at the moment are talking about Apple Vision or talking about AI. So I don't want to dive in too much onto that subject, but I am interested in what you think. Like, we've talked about experiential retail online, making the best of a digital experience. Do you see that, something like Apple Vision or augmented reality or virtual reality, things like that, do you see them having a place in merchandising, in the way you sell online, in the way you promote brand stories online? Do you see that as a part of the future of what Contentful is going to do?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think honestly that just like not necessarily spatial computing as Apple calls it, or like, that channel, but just the ability that if you're using Contentful, you don't have to be panicking right now about like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get our content to that channel? And I mean, not even just Contentful, but just like if you're building in a composable ecosystem, you have the flexibility to adapt to that pretty easily, right? Because I mean,
Yep.
I think, and obviously, like I've seen about as much as the rest of the world has of what that's going to be like, and we don't really know how good the experience will actually be, and if it'll take off or not. But I mean, I think there's absolutely a place for it there, and I think it just ties into that same idea of storytelling that we were talking about
Mm,
earlier, right? Where you can build a cohesive narrative across this stuff. And I mean, like, I'm definitely someone of the opinion that product placement and personalization and things like that, like when it's done well, it doesn't bother me that much. I mean, I think like it's come a long way since sort of the days of like early
yeah.
2000s sitcoms where it was like
It
zoom in on the car logo and then zoom out, but
or you get to the
there's
end
gonna
of
be a
an
lot
article
of
and they're like, haha, we were selling you soap. Like, there's none of
that.
that bait and switch sort of thing going on anymore. Everyone's like, oh, I'm engaged with the brand. I'll read the story because I'm interested in it. It's not like, here's a story. Oh, here's an ad. Like,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and well, and I think like because the content is more nuanced in that regard, like it probably translates to those other mediums
mm,
better, because it's less reliant on like, the 300 by 250 big box or whatever that like sits at the
yeah,
top in the sidebar, right? It's about a more cohesive experience, and sometimes like there might not even be like a direct conversion tied to the thing that you're showing to your users. It's kind of about more of like building that general awareness. And I think just like the the way that's going to change the experience of consuming content, buying things, like all of that, I think is, I don't know, maybe going to be pretty big. Like I don't know that Apple Vision Pro is the thing that's going to change it, just because the form
mm,
factor like frankly still feels a little weird to me. But I mean, who knows, man? Maybe we'll be doing this again in 5 years and we'll both be sitting here wearing our goggles and it'll feel like we're both sitting in your office there checking
oh,
things out. And it's kind of cringy, but I think it's also kind of fascinating just to consider what what that even looks like.
yeah. I think the thing that excites me is for the last, I don't know, the last years of social, right? Let's talk about like the Facebook, TikTok,
Yeah.
Instagram era of brand storytelling, is the way people have been, or the way companies and brands, and particularly true creatives, have been forced to tell their brand story is within the box of what's possible on social, right? They're
Mm.
like, hey, you can now do a reel, or you can now do a video, or you can now do multiple photos in a row, or you can, and the releases of those social platforms is really similar to the way that what happens in monolithic tech stacks where they release features, right? And oh, you have a new feature now available to you, and you're essentially limited by the features that are available. Whereas with
Hmm.
some, when you look at a composable tech stack and you look at having, a headless CMS, or you look at having a something that's like a front end as a service and a headless CMS, the sort of combination of those pieces, you really don't have any limitation to the creative department, to the creatives who tell that brand story. And I think that allows a point of difference in the market for these people to go, hey, we're going to tell our brand story the way we want to. It's not going to be limited by the platforms we use. We can be as creative as we want. And yes, we'll overlay e-commerce best practice in the back end, and we'll do some interesting stuff to make sure it's profitable, but we're not limited in the fact that of the way we can tell our story. I think that's my favorite thing about walking into marketing departments and talking to people like a CMO who have been restricted for so long. And I go, hey, you can get a marketing executive who has a couple of years experience. You can freeze things that you don't want them to touch and give them absolute flexibility with things that you want them to be able to be creative with. And they can go nuts and they can implement things. They can do no code live pushes, right? Where they don't have to talk to a developer to change the structure of the site, change the imagery, drop in a video, do something creative on a product page, do something creative on a collection page, build a campaign landing, like anything that they can think of at a junior level, you can do that now. You don't have to have a steering committee who's going to involve marketing, dev, operations. Like, you don't have to do any of those things. You can just be like, hey, here's what I'm going to let you do. Here's the framework that you can work within. Go nuts, be creative. And I think that's like the most exciting part about all of this is when you tell people that, when you're sitting in the room. Like, I remember talking to Hastings Deering about this and about publishing content, and their eyes are just lighting up like, oh my God, I can do that within my team of marketers, not go to tech and go to the board and make dev changes and cost it out in a roadmap over multiple months. Like, it's just go in tomorrow and make the changes that you want. And that's super exciting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a really interesting parallel you draw. Like just the way the social media platforms are dictating things in that regard. And I mean, kind of to the same point you were making earlier about things like Apple Vision and stuff like that. I mean, I feel like there's some real, and maybe I'm just saying this because I'm like an old guy now, but like, I think there's some real uncertainty to like, yeah, so you'll get it. Some real uncertainty to the direction like social media is going, and I mean, I think you sort of see, sort of the stops and starts at Twitter as they like try new things. And I mean, in some ways that experimentation is interesting. In some ways you're kind of like, okay, is this just going to make people like totally fed up and start to go places that they have more control, similar to, what they're doing? Because, once they get a taste of it using, an experience like you do in the composable space on a platform like Contentful, like, are you going to want to be like stuck in those same guardrails? I mean, I know social commerce, for instance, is something I've been like real interested in lately. Just again, like, as someone, fully admit, I've never like bought anything through like an Instagram shoppable ad or anything like that, but I mean, part of me is kind of like, well, is this like just a gimmick? Is this kitschy? Is this going to stick around? Is it going to be a thing? Because I mean, it kind of puts you in those guardrails, but at the same time, it's like, when you have the flexibility to experiment in that channel and like see if it works. And also, I mean, I don't know what businesses are like spinning up their own Mastodon servers and stuff like that, but I mean, also the flexibility to support pushing that same content to places like that where you do have more of that flexibility and stuff. I think it really speaks to the value that I think, the value we talk about every day, right? And like kind of ties it to the real thing and just makes that a little bit less scary and frustrating, right? And enables people, just like you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's I think it can seem like it's a world of possibilities, but also like you're boxed in when you're brand side. And in my experience, quite often you're like wedded to these platforms, right? And you're wedded to the way that the business has always done things. And I think the exciting part is that, particularly in looking at composable, is you just have the ultimate flexibility where changing out a platform, whether it's like a search and merch tool, or whether it's personalization, or the way you do automations, or the way you do content, changing things out and getting new tech in, or you changing the way that you're using the tech is relatively easy compared to what it used to be. It's relatively fast compared to what it used to be. And it's obviously the way technology should go, because you should be able to make changes based on your business's shifting priorities, right? Like that should be something that you should be able to do. Like if you walked in, like if a new creative director walks into a business, they want to be able to make a change, right? And that change can be broad sweeping across the business. Whereas before it would be like, yeah, you can change like the print catalogs and you can change our ads relatively quickly, but everything else is going to take time. Now
Right.
you're looking at like, you can change everything in a matter of a season, right? From a fashion perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really exciting part of composable. And that's where I'm seeing the future of it. But the current thing that I'm seeing, like I said before, is just such a year of weird and a year of like exciting businesses that I didn't know existed that are future thinking. And I think that that's going to be and I'm not sure if you're seeing it in the States too, if it's a market dynamic, if it's a maybe just the way Overdose is positioned, I'm not really sure, but I've definitely seen like a shift from what I thought when I thought I was talking about content, what I would be selling, to what I am has been massively different. And the people who want optionality aren't the people that I expected.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. And I mean, I'm certainly seeing a lot of that too. And I mean, I think, you know, in some ways, I feel like there are maybe a lot of these direct to consumer startup darling brands that feel like they've pioneered that a little bit. And the more you learn
Mm,
about it, you're like, oh, they don't have the flexibility they want on the back end. And I feel like there's a really interesting intersection of like the perception of what those brands are doing when like, you know, the really big brands, or I mean like the B2B businesses see that and they're like, oh man, we need to keep up. And they actually have like the resources and like the dollars to make that happen a little bit quickly. Right.
yeah.
And both of them are kind of like, I feel like converging on this similar goal of, you know, producing great experiences and producing them quickly. But, you know, one is kind of coming from, you know, a world where they move really slow and just like can't get things done. And maybe the brands are outdated, and the other is maybe coming from a world where they're like, everybody thinks they're super hip and can move really fast. But in reality, you know, they're running on like, I don't know, a really tiny like homegrown website on a server that somebody like runs under their desk, because that's just like what you do when you're starting up a business, you know. And I think the commonality there is they all see that value of like, we need to consolidate on a digital stack that like makes it easier for us to like tell these stories and sort of create these like compelling experiences more quickly.
Oh, this is an interesting one. And it goes to us talking about distilling content and distilling
Mm.
doing things. But Nelson Harris has asked, what's the number one thing you would want someone who is new to the idea of composable to understand about it?
Ooh, I like that question. And that's very hard to pick just one. And I mean, I think the one thing actually is that it's not a giant, scary technical undertaking. Like at the end of the day, we kind of touched on this earlier, but at the end of the day, composable is about making things easier for your least technical users, right? It's about enabling everybody at the company to get things done and to show value quickly, right? And obviously like there's a lot of other stuff we could talk about that goes into that, but I think ultimately like, you know, again, speaking from someone who like came from this background of like, oh, you know, headless just means like more complication, you have to maintain your front end separately, and that's just like way more trouble than it's worth. And like now being here sitting where I am, it's like, oh, you know, I get it. Like I see the value. This is about speed, it's about empathy, it's about making things easy, and it's about moving fast. So
Mm,
we'll call that one thing, but it was maybe more.
yeah, I like that. I think my thing is that you don't have to do it all at once. Like quite often
Yeah.
when these projects, the big versions of these projects come up, you're signing 5, 6, 7 different contracts at once where you used to sign one, right? You're getting in an Algolia for search, you're getting in Contentful for the front end, you might have commerce tools or, you know, any of the other potential options for commerce. And that can be really scary for businesses, especially if you don't have that, you know, kind of visionary CTO and visionary CMO who's willing to take on a project like that. But I think that the thing to realize is pick what your problem is. Like you were talking about earlier, what's the biggest frustration in the business? What's really hurting you? And you can start down a composable journey by picking someone who is composable friendly, right? Picking a product that is composable friendly and adding it into your current stack, right? Like I had a great meeting yesterday with the guys at Fluent Commerce, who are an OMS, which is a composable first OMS. And people don't think of order management systems when they think about exciting experiences, but it'll allow you to solve things like omni-channel stuff that is still really hard to do, buy online, drop off, return in store, all of those operationally really hard things for brands to do. And you can do that with a composable friendly product that allows you to adapt your stack. Like people often think, if you're sitting on Adobe right now, people might think, oh, I inherited this. I don't know much about it. I don't know much about the implementation. I'd have to change everything to make changes. It's not true. You can make small tweaks and adjustments that turn your current Adobe stack into a composable architecture. And I find that is like a really interesting thing, is like just focus on the problem that you're trying to solve first. Do that, prove out the business case, and then you focus on the next problem and then the next one. And it's an iterative process where you're really showing business value along the line, rather than the traditional way of doing it was like, you give me a large sum of cash, I will come back to you in 2 years with a ta-da moment, right? And those conversations don't need to exist anymore. No one wants that. You try selling that to a CTO, a CEO, sorry, going like, hey, can I have a really large chunk of our CapEx budget, and in 2 years' time, I'll come back to you with something pretty amazing? What everyone wants now is like prove it out, take little steps along the path to improving your end consumer's experience and have empathy for what their experience should be, and just focus on that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. Well, and I love that you kind of like brought it back around to empathy for the end user's experience, right? Because I think it just like ties both of what we said together so nicely that, I mean, it doesn't have to be a big complicated thing to make things easier for your team, like for your end users, for anyone that touches your digital experiences, right? Like it's just agile and focus on the problems, like you said, right? It's like surprisingly hard to get people aligned on the right problems and to like truly articulate a critical business issue that will have real impact when you're able to resolve that issue, right? And it's tough, but it's
I think actually just rounding out that thought train, I think it's probably one of my favorite things about having worked with you for a little while now, is also your empathy. Like I think one of the first conversations we had, I was like, just found out that my wife's pregnant. And you're like, I've got 2 boys. And the whole thread of our friendship that we've built over these projects has been around, I'm like, how are they going? And I'm like, what happens when I was like, is vomiting on me regularly normal? And you're like, yeah, that's fine. I find that like it's your personality type also suits that sort of approach too.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, like, gosh, totally lost my train of thought there. But I mean, I was kind of thinking about, it's been such a common thread, like through the whole thing, like that, empathy and like my comment earlier about like the enterprise sales experience with software and stuff. And it's just like, it doesn't have to be that. Like you can bring some real humanity to it, and I mean, like build a relationship with everybody around you that you're working with, because ultimately, like, we're all trying to solve the same problems and accomplish the same goals, which are like deeply rooted in just like making people's digital experiences not be terrible. you know? And I mean, maybe I'll flip that and say making people's digital experiences be really great, because let's be glass half full about the whole thing,
Yeah, exactly. And I think my visual experience in dealing with you has been similar to your auditory experience of dealing with me. It's quite often there's a crying baby in the background. And for you, I noticed today you've got your door fully shut behind you, but usually it's open just a crack. and sometimes you see a little head pop around the corner and just check if you're on a call or not, because obviously,
Oh
it's
man.
late your time there, so it's dad time for you.
Oh man, that's a very keen observation. I love that. Like during the day, it's so the cat doesn't stand outside there scratching at the door, and at night, it's so yeah, little eyes can peek in when they need to.
Yeah, no, it's lovely.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
Nick, mate, it's been absolutely wonderful to catch up and chat with you. I know we'll do it plenty of times over. But if anyone's heard this and gone, geez, I'd really love to hear more about Contentful, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
yeah, I mean, email, honestly, like first name dot last name at Contentful. I'd like to say I'm an avid social user on all sorts of different platforms, but I'm really not great at it. And I mean, I certainly reach out on LinkedIn, like I'm there. I'm probably most active there. So, I'd be more than happy to like answer follow-up questions, like dig in a little bit more to Composable. And yeah, like, just I'm here because I love talking about this stuff. So always happy to
Yeah,
dig into it a
nice.
little bit
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
You're quite an evangelist in the space, I think, mate. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about all this. I hope everyone's taken the time to listen and got a little bit of value out of this, because I know I have.
Awesome. Well, I mean, thanks for having me. I can say the same about you. Like it's been fantastic working together, and I know I always look forward and try to find ways to get you and Overdose involved with projects that we're working on, because like it's certainly always great stuff.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Nick, thank you for that, and enjoy your Thursday night and the rest of your whiskey. I'll get through my coffee and I'll chat to you soon.
Hey, cheers. Thanks, Shane.